Gujaratna, as a young boy, around the ages of 2 and 3, talked to himself, and his mother overheard him. He was saying, "I was born with this bad arm because I killed my wife." She knew nothing about any killing, but she mentioned the matter to her husband, who said, when he heard more details, "He's talking about my brother." And what Gujaratna was saying was true of his father's brother, who was Ratranhami, who had indeed killed his wife.
Welcome to Vanadium. Many lives, many dreams, many experiments. The more I learn about this mad world, the more mysterious it seems to me. In science, it's a painstaking, time-consuming, and expensive process. And generally it takes decades and careers to really accomplish groundbreaking work. And there's no long line of investors looking to fund research into past lives, mystical experiences, and even if it answers the great questions, soothes the deepest fears, and pushes humankind forward. What's really interesting, though, is that the work sort of happens anyway, because of passion and curiosity, and men like Ian Stevenson, who accomplished the science, got the data, and analyzed it with the greatest skepticism. His work, it annihilates criticism with its depth and systematic precision. And it doesn't get much more convincing than when Dr. Stevenson is found. And what I question is why no one has heard of him. His research into past lives spans decades, and his interviews with children are more than compelling and persuasive. They're convincing. His funding came from benefactors like one of the founders of Xerox. He published a magnum opus in 1997, over 2,200 pages, in which he cites over 5,000 cases. It's titled Reincarnation in Biology. Out of these 5,000 cases, 2,500 of them were verified by physical and historical investigation, third-party investigations. The great physicist Doris Kuhlmann-Wilsdorf, whose groundbreaking theories on surface physics earned her the prestigious Hein Medal from the German Society for Material Sciences, she surmised that Stevenson's work had established that the statistical probability that reincarnation does in fact occur is so overwhelming that it cumulatively meets the standard for most, if not all, branches of science. The thing is that this is not heaven is for real. These cases, they don't follow any kind of sort of pretty story. It's not really warm and fuzzy. These cases are kind of creepy and they're kind of mysterious. And it seems like in a lot of the cases, something's out of whack, something's upset or unbalanced. These children remember lives with abrupt and violent ends. In a lot of cases, some of these children are born with a taste for vengeance. And sometimes Stevenson observed that the children had habits and fears linked to the nature of the death from the previous life. And those who've said they've drowned in a previous life, said Stevenson, had an unusually intense fear of water. Those who were stabbed displayed a crippling knife phobia, and so on. Then there were 3 cases of children who reacted violently when they unexpectedly crossed paths with their own murderers. It's bizarre to picture preschoolers lunging for the throats of adult strangers. Those are the kind of stories that, and thousands of them, that Dr. Stevenson investigated and documented over the years.
I also became aware of the complexity of the cases. My first idea was that these cases just consist of a child saying, "I am so-and-so, I used to live in such and such, I want to go back and be with my real family," and that was it. But that wasn't it. In fact, there were what I came to call behavioral memories, fears, aversions, special and unusual likings. unusual play in which the child seemed to be reenacting the vocation or the avocation of the past life remembered. This child, Parmo Sharma, claimed to remember the previous life of a shopkeeper who had also a machine for making soda water. In those days in India, there was no such thing as bottled water, let alone bottled soda water. Or
Ian Prettyman Stevenson. What a great middle name. He's a handsome fellow, too. He was born in Montreal, Canada in 1918, and like me, he was one of 3 children. His father was a Scottish reporter on assignment with the family. And what's interesting is his mother was really into theosophy and the teachings of Helena Blavatsky. Remember that name from a few episodes ago? And this is where Stevenson's upbringing was really interesting, and it's where his fascination with the occult started. Started like a lot of things start, as a child at home. He started medical school in Scotland at St. Andrews, but he had to move to McGill in Canada because of the start of World War II. And he got his MD in 1943, and everything was going great, but he developed some issues with his lungs. It wasn't tuberculosis, but he was having some sort of aggravated condition with his lungs. So he had to move his wife actually to Phoenix in the USA, which is kind of a big move. But I think it alleviated his issues. And he was just to get to the dry climate. And he eventually became a U.S. citizen in 1949.
Nana Tilika was quite boyish. So here I encountered the first case of the sex change type, of which I was later to see many more examples. And now, still in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it then was, we have the case of Gujaratna. Notice his shrunken right arm compared with his left, and you see the muscle of the right chest, the major muscle, is missing. He has a rare syndrome, first described by a British physician called Poland. That's as in the country, but he wasn't Polish, he was British. Poland syndrome is a very rare malformation occurring in fewer than 1 in 20,000 births. Gujaratna, as a young boy, around the ages of 2 and 3, talked to himself, and his mother overheard him. He was saying, "I was born with this bad arm because I killed my wife." She knew nothing about any killing, but she mentioned the matter to her husband, who said, when he heard more details, "He's talking about my brother." And what Gujaratna was saying was true of his father's brother, who was Ratranhami, who had indeed killed his wife. More properly speaking, he'd killed his fiancée, but in Sri Lanka, engagements are much more serious affairs than they are in most Western countries.
Pretty early in his career, though, you could really sense the dissatisfaction with medicine, science, and the sort of overwhelming culture of reductionism that was growing in technical fields. And as time went on, he started to become very interested in psychosomatic illnesses and medicine and the overall influence of the mind over the body. And that's sort of going in the opposite direction of where medicine was going at the time. But his medical career was still moving up. He's, had the respect of his peers, even though a lot of them didn't agree with his theories. He still was going places with his career, and it's really amazing. Despite all the, I imagine the talk behind his back was probably pretty extreme. His beliefs, even early on in his career, made him part of the intellectual minority. He ended up teaching medicine at Louisiana State University. Got the job despite his unconventional opinions, which I think is kind of amazing. And his work, it got the interest of the Brave New World, the mescaline man himself, Aldous Huxley. And the two of them, I found this out pretty late on in my research, that the two of them actually hung out. And by hang out, I think that means take acid together. Because Stevenson, I didn't know this. You know the names, Timothy Leary. Names like Timothy Leary. But Stevenson was kind of on that level. He was one of the first and the few academics to legally research and actually try LSD on himself. He called the experience, and this is interesting, 3 days of serenity. Now, from what I've only, of course, read, LSD can last for maybe 12 or 16 hours. But 3 whole days? Damn. I don't know if the acid was stronger back then or if he was taking an elephant's dose. I don't know. But he had a very good experience with acid, and he was very open about it. One of the other things that he was famous for was working against the idea that children's brains are more flexible and that they can learn things more quickly and effectively. He was against that. He said that, he argued that adults have only self-imposed limitations. They sort of have this idea that they're not good at things, they're not going to pick them up, whereas kids don't really know any better. So they're just able to learn things. Really, it's due to the bias in the adults, and that all of these limits that people put on themselves, they could just kind of float away if you let them. And he published a paper about this in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which is a really high-level journal. And although it was published, and I believe he had the cover, he got a lot of hate for it. I think people wrote letters to the journal complaining about, these like his crackpot theories, which I think is really ridiculous, that met the peer review standard. And I'm sure it met probably more than the typical peer review standard, because the journal itself was probably taking a risk by allowing it in there. But he, this was one of his first big papers. And, even though there was a lot of fallout from his opinions and his claims, he characterizes his experience with his first academic paper as ultimately positive, because it prepared him for a whole career of rejection. So I think, he has an interesting perspective. And, he would have to have a positive perspective like that and a glasses half full type attitude to be able to do what he did with his life. And he continued his work on psychosomatic illnesses throughout his career. And he was always trying to figure out, why was there such a strong connection of the mind and body? And he interviewed several patients that had interesting stories about the origins of their mysterious illnesses, and originating in past lives. So this is where he became kind of focused on past life regression and the idea of reincarnation. He published a paper about this in Harper's Bazaar, and actually got the attention of the William James Society, the great psychologist William James, famous for his theories and his insights, and also his nitrous oxide use, and the American Society for Psychical Research. And he won a prize for this, and he got attention of people who were interested in actually funding his work. So one of these guys was a guy called Chester Carlson, and he was not only one of the founders of Xerox, he was one of the inventors of the core technology. And he was really behind what Dr. Stevenson was doing. And he was able to fund Stevenson's work handsomely. And now this is where his work really got moving. This is where he really focused on reincarnation. And his best-known work during this time involves children between the age of 2 and 5 years old, which I thought was kind of interesting. There were a few cases of adults, but really the lion's share of his research is with fairly young children. And he said this was the best way to disregard fakers and charlatans and people that were coming in there trying to, just hang out with a doctor or just get attention. But what he also said that there was a special window during these childhood years that was just ripe for mystical experiences and access to past life memories. So the idea was that children, they haven't forgotten yet. So they have access to all this kind of information that adults, I guess, put in the back bin. They sort of put it away in the warehouse like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
These are twins of England, Gillian and Jennifer. Jennifer had 2 birthmarks. Gillian had none. They are, by the way, identical, that is, monozygotic. There's Jennifer's had a birthmark here. But this slide is the most interesting. It shows them as they're learning to write. They remembered the previous lives of 2 older sisters who had been killed by a car driver who ran off the pavement onto the sidewalk while they were walking. And at that time, Jennifer, who was remembering the previous life of the older sister called Jacqueline, was just learning to write. Her older sister, Joanna, is holding the pen here. Notice that she grips the pen in a conventional way. At least it seemed conventional to most people. But Jennifer here is holding the pencil with a fist. And these 2 ways of writing correspond to the ways that the older sisters, who were respectively 11 and 6, had. So this, I claim, is a behavioral memory. These twins, to repeat, are monozygotic. They're identical twins. One has 2 birthmarks, the other none. One has this writing feature. These are, does anybody recognize these? These are Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins. They weren't Siamese, but that doesn't matter. We can let that go. They were conjoined. What's interesting to me about them is that Eng, who's on the left, was irascible, irritable, and he drank, sometimes excessively. Toward the end of his life, he was at the level of debauchery. Eng, on the other hand, was gentle, quiet, bookish, and virtually a teetotaler. How to account for that? They didn't remember previous lives, but they epitomized the problem that these children pose.
And one of these, this is kind of a typical case. So one of his patients, this 5-year-old boy, was suffering from really terrible nightmares and sort of strange psychosomatic illnesses. In the interview, the boy mentioned a past life where he was shot and murdered. And this kind of took Stevenson aback. This is kind of a crazy thing for a child to say, although children do say crazy things. But what's more is that the child, the 5-year-old, recalled specific details about the previous identity. And this was somebody who was nowhere nearby, hundreds of miles away. And the child was able to give enough information that Stevenson and his team located the deceased guy's family, the guy who was the other life, the past life. Now that's pretty amazing. This was the days way before the internet. I mean, information was not so easily found, and it was kind of, even if you had information on somebody, it wasn't so simple to track them down. And Stevenson, so he found the murdered man's family and talked to the guy's sister, and he got more details about the guy's death. And it turns out that he was shot in the throat, and also that he had an exit wound on the back of his head. So Stevenson, with this information, went back and examined the boy and found these kind of strange birthmarks consistent with the murder man's entrance and exit bullet wounds. And this wasn't just a single case. He would end up investigating hundreds of similar cases like this. And odd birthmarks and unexplained illnesses were common with these children. It's really fascinating. And thousands of cases like this with birthmarks and psychosomatic illnesses. And Stevenson concluded that, he wasn't somebody that really jumped to reincarnation. He was, really scientific in his viewpoint. He wanted to be as skeptical as possible. But what he concluded was that reincarnation was the best possible explanation. And the reasons that he cites: the large number of witnesses and the lack of apparent motivation, opportunity to make fraud likely. These children aren't getting anything out of it. And also there are a lot of witnesses and there's a lot of substantiating evidence. And so there's just the large amount of information possessed by the child's family is just not consistent with the idea that the child obtained that information through investigated contact. It just doesn't make sense. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that he frequently observed similar personality characteristics and also skills that the children had that they couldn't have obtained in their current life. And also it's cases of having some language ability, accessing language that the children had no exposure to. And, the correlation between congenital deformities and birthmarks. And not only birthmarks, but children missing kind of fingers and other limbs. And it ended up coinciding with injuries from the past life.
Do you have any theory about how, in fact, the impact on the morphic field can carry over to the new life and have an effect on the new body?
Well, as I said, I think there is some kind of vehicle, which I call a psychophore. That's just an English adaptation of a Greek word meaning mind carrying. So there's nothing very new about it. But I think you have to imagine some kind of a vehicle. I have immense respect for Rupert Sheldrake, but I don't think he's come to grips with the individual cases that we have deployed.
And he traveled all over the world and did a lot of this work in India. And he got funding from Xerox, the founder of Xerox, and Eileen Garrett, who was the founder of the Parapsychology Foundation. And he still, he had the support of the parapsychology. He had the support of the parapsychology field, but he still didn't really argue for reincarnation. He just said he couldn't come up with a better way to fit the data, like a true scientist. And I think that's the right way to see the world. And he ended, during his career, he was the chairman of the psychiatry department at the University of Virginia for over 40 years. And he was promoted into that job at 38. Now, at 38, for that level of academic position, that's pretty extraordinary. Normally, academics are far older when they get this kind of promotion. The Journal of the American Medical Association describes Stevenson's work as painstaking and unemotional. The Journal of the American Medical Association describes Stevenson's work as a painstaking and unemotional collection of cases that were difficult to explain on any assumption other than reincarnation. So this is the American Medical Association now getting on board. He did have, Stevenson had his share of critics, but what's interesting is that his critics, they were critical of his work, and they of course wanted more evidence, and they had questions about his methodology, but they never really called him a crackpot. And he did command their respect over the length of his career. Just to give you an example, one of his critics, a psychologist, Ian Wilson, he acknowledged that Stevenson had brought, and I'm quoting, a new professionalism to a crank-prone field. And another one of his critics, Paul Edwards, wrote that Stevenson has written more fully and more intelligibly in defense of reincarnation than anybody else. Edwards also wrote, I have the highest regard for his honesty. All of his case reports contain items that can be made the basis of criticism. Stevens could have easily suppressed this information. The fact that he did not speaks well for his integrity. So that's the thing. Stevenson, he kept things in his papers that did invite some criticism, which, there are scientists that don't do that. They paint you the prettiest picture possible. They don't want any kind of doubt. And that's just typically not the way science works when you're being honest about it. His critics were they were not in shortage of the sort of general complaints about the fantastical nature of the findings, but they never really had much in the way of concrete objections to the direct case evidence. They never really had any specific criticisms that really took any of his studies apart. Here are some quotes from Stevenson. Reincarnation, as least as I conceive it, does not nullify what we know about evolution and genetics. It suggests, however, that there may be two streams of evolution, the biological one and a personal one, and that during terrestrial lives, these streams interact. That's a pretty quote. Here's another one. Difficulties arise when reported observations seem to conflict with facts that the majority of scientists accept as established and immutable. Scientists tend to reject conflicting observations. Nevertheless, the history of science shows that new observations and theories can eventually prevail. Right on. So is Stevenson right? And there are other people that have followed on to his work, and they've seen similar data. And same thing, no real serious complaints about that work either. But what happens is that you just don't hear about these scientists. And that's how the work is stopped. Not stopped, but that's how the work is slowed. It's just the lack of attention from the media. And it's amazing because of how extraordinary this is and what it means. What does it mean? What happens during childhood? Do we learn, maybe along with learning new things throughout our lives? We forget important things as well. Past lives, past loves, horrors and memories. This is Vanadium. Thank you very much. Stay safe.